On the morning of the 11th of January 1993, Britain's national airline stood up in the High Court in London and apologised, unreservedly, to this man. A bearded entrepreneur in a jumper, standing on the courtroom pavement with a grin he could barely contain. British Airways agreed to pay him £500,000. £110,000 went to his airline, Virgin Atlantic. Legal costs would climb towards £3 million. At the time, it was described as one of the largest libel settlements in British legal history. British Airways' counterclaim against Richard Branson was withdrawn at the same time. In open court, BA's lawyer told the judge that the airline's directors had not been involved in any campaign against Branson or Virgin Atlantic. By that evening, BA's own public relations consultant would swear, on oath, something very different. So what had British Airways actually done to deserve this, and who, inside the airline, had ordered it? To understand why a national airline ended up apologising to a man in a jumper, you have to go back. In June 1984, Richard Branson launched Virgin Atlantic with a single leased Boeing 747 and a route from London Gatwick to Newark. He was a record label boss with a beard, a grin, and almost no experience of aviation. 3 years later, British Airways was privatised. Its chairman, Lord King, had spent years stripping the state-owned carrier for the city, cutting the workforce from 60,000 down to 38,000. By the early 1990s, British Airways held around 39% of the transatlantic market. It flew between London and 21 US cities. Virgin Atlantic flew only 6. BA controlled roughly 40% of the slots at Heathrow and 31% at Gatwick. Lord King was the lion of British business. Branson, in King's telling, was a nuisance in a woolly jumper. Years later, King would say that if Branson had worn steel-rimmed glasses and shaved off his beard, he might have taken him seriously. He chose not to take him seriously, and by the summer of 1991, he was about to wish he had. July 1991. Virgin Atlantic was finally allowed into Heathrow, BA's home airport and its most profitable runway. Soon after, Virgin picked up traffic rights into Tokyo. The upstart was now inside the wire, competing for BA's most lucrative passengers on some of the most lucrative routes in the world. Inside British Airways, Lord King was furious. According to multiple accounts, he summoned his chief executive, Colin Marshall, and his director of public affairs, David Burnside, and he is said to have told them, in 4 words, exactly what he wanted done. Do something about Branson. The phrase has been reported many times. It has never been verified in a court record. But what happened next, inside British Airways, suggests that someone, somewhere, took that instruction very seriously. Passengers who had booked with Virgin Atlantic began receiving phone calls, at the airport and even at home. The caller would say their Virgin flights had been delayed or cancelled or even rescheduled, and then offer them a seat on a British Airways plane instead. Inside the industry, that has a name: switch selling. To do it, BA staff allegedly needed something they were not supposed to have: Virgin's confidential passenger booking data. According to Virgin's allegations, that information was being pulled from computer systems and used to target Virgin customers one by one. Some British Airways employees, it was alleged, even impersonated Virgin staff on the phone. While that was happening on the ground, another operation was running in the press. BA's public relations consultant Basham was engaged to plant hostile and negative stories about Branson and Virgin in newspapers across the city. The campaign carried internal code names: Mission Atlantic, Operation Barbara, Hunters, Helpliners, and one with a flavour all of its own, Operation Covent Garden, which reportedly involved private investigators and the theft of dustbin bags from outside Virgin's offices. The only question left was how anyone outside BA would ever find out. The phone calls came back to Virgin. So did the complaints. Passengers described strange contacts, flights that had never been cancelled, voices on the line that didn't sound quite right. Then something else started happening. Inside British Airways, employees who were uncomfortable with what they were seeing began quietly reaching out to Virgin. By October 1991, Richard Branson had a stack of evidence, customer statements, internal details, and a pattern that he believed could only come from something coordinated. In December, he wrote directly to British Airways non-executive directors, laying out what he believed was happening, and asking them to investigate. British Airways dismissed his claims as fabricated for publicity. And then BA went further. It filed a counterclaim against him. Branson had been warned this would happen. Sir Freddie Laker, whose own airline had collapsed years earlier after a separate dispute that involved British Airways, had given him a piece of advice that he would quote for the rest of his life. "When they come after you," Laker told him, "and they will, shout long, shout hard, and then sue the Branson was about to do exactly that. In 1992, the dispute stopped being private. Thames Television's current affairs programme This Week aired a documentary about the campaign. Behind a disguised voice and a darkened silhouette, a man who said he was a British Airways employee described being told to shred documents relating to Virgin. Inside British Airways, the official line did not change. The airline's internal staff newspaper, BA News, ran an article calling Branson's dirty tricks allegations a publicity stunt. Lord King wrote in similar terms. Those words, printed by BA itself, signed off in BA's own communications, became the legal hook that Branson had been waiting for. He sued for libel, and British Airways promised it would fight the case in court, and for a while it looked like it would. Which brings us back to the 11th of January 1993, the High Court in London. Branson's lawyer was George Carman, one of the most feared advocates in the country. In open court, Carman set out what Virgin alleged BA's people had been doing: the switch selling, the access to Virgin's confidential booking data, the press campaign by Basham. Then British Airways counsel Christopher Clark QC stood up and apologised unreservedly. He told the judge that BA accepted that there had been incidents involving its employees, which were regrettable and which had given Richard Branson and Virgin Atlantic reasonable grounds for concern. In the same statement, he insisted that BA's directors had not been party to any concerted campaign against Branson or Virgin Atlantic. £500,000 was awarded to Branson personally, £110,000 to Virgin Atlantic. Legal costs estimated at up to £3 million. The counterclaim against him was now gone. Outside, the headlines wrote themselves. The Sun newspaper ran the front page that everyone remembers. Virgin screws BA. And then Branson did something nobody expected. He took the entire £610,000 in damages and divided it between Virgin Atlantic's staff. They called it the BA bonus. For a moment it looked like the story was over, but it wasn't, because by the time those checks were being handed out, BA's own PR man was already on his way to detonate the airline's defence. Hours after British Airways stood in the High Court and told a judge that its directors had nothing to do with any concerted campaign, Basham released a sworn statement. The PR consultant who had run BA's press operation against Branson wrote one line that would hang over the airline for 30 years. At no time, he swore, did he act without the knowledge or approval of the British Airways Board of Directors. A supporting letter from Basham's lawyer went even further. It named 3 men as having given full authority to his action: Lord King, Sir Colin Marshall and Robert Ayling. British Airways denied it, and Basham's claims were never tested at trial. They couldn't be, the case was already settled. The case had ended, the contradiction had not. There were consequences, just not many. In June 1993, Lord King retired as chairman of British Airways, 6 months earlier than scheduled. Sir Colin Marshall, the chief executive named in Basham's lawyer's letter, took over as chairman. David Burnside, BA's Director of Public Affairs, left the company. As for the employees who had actually made the phone calls, accessed the data, and shredded the documents, BA declined to say whether anyone had been disciplined. Their names were never made public. Branson kept pushing. In April 1993, he filed a $325 million antitrust action against BA in the United States, accusing it of dominating the transatlantic market through anti-competitive conduct. In 1994, a US judge refused BA's attempt to throw the case out, and the core claims were allowed to proceed. That same year, Virgin won another £2.5 million from BA in a separate UK case over aircraft maintenance. But the big American case went on for years, and finally, in 1999, it was dismissed. Reconciliation attempts came and went. By the end of the decade, BA had apologised, paid, lost senior figures, and watched 2 American legal threats expire. What it had not done was say on the record how high inside the company it really went. Westminster, 25th of November 2024. At an aviation industry conference called Airlines 2024, the chief executive of Virgin Atlantic, Shay Weiss, was asked about his relationship with the chief executive of British Airways. His answer surprised everyone. He said he would not meet the boss of British Airways one-on-one. He said he remembered the Dirty Tricks campaign that British Airways had launched against Virgin, and he said he was not going to get caught out. 31 years after British Airways stood in the High Court and apologised. 31 years after one of the largest libel settlements in British legal history. And 31 years after Basham swore that the BA Board of Directors had known everything. The cheque was paid, the chairman left, and the case was closed. But the question that Basham raised that night, how high inside British Airways it really went, was never answered. And now, it probably never will be.